Halal. I hail from the great sanctuary state of California. Welcome. I bring you greetings from Gavin Newsom. Thank you. I'm glad this is live streamed. Anyway, I'm happy to be part of the GenSpec team, and it's my honor to introduce our next guest. If you don't know him, he's a delightful human being. I can't decide if he's more fun on X or in person. It's a toss-up. But our next speaker is Dr. James Lindsay. I know a lot of you have read his books and listened to his podcast. He is an author, a mathematician, political commentator. He's written a ton of books. I can't keep track, but it says on his bio he's written 8 at this point. He's also the founder of New Discourses, so sign that, Substacks, subscribe, join. He's the co-author of Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. It's a great book. And he's the author of Race Marxism, as well as his newest book, another great book, The Marxification of Education. He's often on the media. He's been on Joe Rogan many times. He's been on Jordan Peterson. He spoke at the Oxford Union. You can watch that debate online on YouTube. It's really a fun debate. And he recently spoke at the European Parliament as well. So I bring you Dr. James Lindsay. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. This is for your protection. This is a timer. We got to keep you safe. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the time. The problem is that I've got about two different whole talks I kind of want to give to you because I couldn't quite decide what I wanted to say. So I'll just warm you up a little bit by telling you, Dr. Bailey just spoke, and he said he was going to say something controversial, and my heart smiled. I was like, my sweet summer child. So this might be a little bit controversial. So both of these two topics that I actually kind of want to find time to address are going to be a bit controversial. It's maybe a different way. If you know my work, it's not a different way. But if you're not familiar with my work, this is going to be a bit of a different characterization. I primarily study the ideology, what you guys in this room probably would refer to as gender ideology, which has this kind of co-created, related, cross-pollinating ideological framework called queer theory attached to it. And my most recent book, The Queering of the American Child, is about the insertion of queer theory into education. And so it describes what queer theory is. It actually describes how queer theory is a derivative of Marxist theory. So now we're going to start wading into that controversial water. And I think I'll start with an extraordinarily properly controversial sentence. Gender doesn't exist. Let's just get over it. I spent most of the spring trying to figure out the basis for that claim, which I generally intuited and has become kind of a buzzword in the pushback against ROGD and other trans medicine and so on. We know that our friend Billboard Chris Elston is famous for saying there are 2 sexes, 0 genders, and infinite personalities, which Charlie Kirk has taken to using without credit, which is sort of funny. But it's true. There are no genders. The term gender identity arises, and I'm not going to go into this long history, but I've discovered it came from Stoller and Greenson in 1964, and what they were trying to describe was one's internal sense of being male or female, and they were very clear that it was one's internal sense of being male or female. So from the beginning, the thing they got called gender identity was binary, which is kind of funny because it's not any longer. And what they were actually doing, and Alex Byrne, if many of you would know from, I think he's at MIT, has done excellent work on this, kind of traced this history and pointed out that it would have been far more accurate had Stoller and Greenson not been so polite. And instead of calling what they were trying to describe as gender identity, if he would have called it, or they would have called it sex identity, one's sense of being one's sex, we could have skipped a lot of trouble. Because very infamously, what happened, just for the little history here, what happened next was a much more controversial character by the name of John Money picked up this idea from Stoller and Greenson a few years later in the late 1960s. And because he worked in what we now call, and I think it's a far better term than the previous terms, disorders of sexual development was one of his research specialties. He had this problem of people that it was difficult to classify cleanly, which we're still dealing with in the Olympics, obviously, in the boxing, cleanly into male or female. Now, if we had some biologists here, they would say they'd be able to explain in tremendous detail, and I'm sure maybe we have some in the room, why it's not as hard as it seems. But back when Money was writing about what he called at the time hermaphroditism, which I don't even think is a word you're allowed to say in polite culture now, and then later it got called intersex, which is a bogus term because there is no such thing as being in between sexes. There are disorders of sexual development. Like I said, I think that this is a better term. Since Money was working on those, my reading of John Money is very clearly that he was trying to describe this feeling of sex identity outlined by Stoller and Greenson while not actually referencing the essential biological fact underneath. So how do we have sex without sex? So at this point, and I mean biological sex without sex, not any of the activity stuff. And so this is a complete divorce from reality. And so gender identity, by the time John Money is pushing it for whatever his reasons are, and I don't necessarily think these particular reasons were bad, becomes divorced from reality. It is now phenomenon precedes essence, to talk very philosophically. So it's a phenomenological philosophical approach to the concept of who we are, as opposed to an essentialist concept of who we are. And if you've read any feminist literature in the last 50 years, you know that they're not big on sex essentialism or biological essentialism. They attack it rigorously and constantly. And it turns out that they are the next chapter in this story, so this is where this gets really, really controversial. It's not just that gender doesn't exist, it's that we have to thank not primarily John Money for this disaster, although there are lots of reasons to thank John Money for this disaster, or blame. We have and I will be very particular here so that I don't get eggs thrown at me, we have the sex-positive radical feminists to blame for this mutation into the queer theory and gender ideology pair of ways of thinking about the world. I say that very clearly, having read Gail Rubin, who was one of these characters. Gail Rubin wrote very clearly in some essay, I forgot what the essay is called, but it's a chapter in her 2011 anthology called Deviations, near the very beginning. Actually, I think it's the introduction to Deviations, so it may be unique to that book, not one of her essays. And she said she got accused by other authors of having appropriated John Money's idea of gender, which is divorced from sex, in kind of the phenomenological, ethereal world of social norms and social expectations and social constructions. And she said, well, of course I did. But she gets accused not just of appropriating it, but not citing him, which is, it's not academic misconduct anymore, but it used to be big academic misconduct. So she defended herself, and she said, of course I did. Of course I used John Money's ideas. And of course, the reason is because they were just, in her own words, the air, the water, it's like the water that we drank, the air that we breathed, the food that we ate, and the conversations and all of the feminist pamphlets we were circulating through the entirety of the 1970s. So the feminist literature, radical feminist literature specifically in the 1970s, was going through a split, and it was appropriating this concept of gender identity. That kind of the end of that train track is where we are today. These are not, just to be very clear, I do like to just blame feminists for things, and then they get mad at me, and I say the hags are mad, and they get madder, and then they say James called women hags, and I say no, I called feminists hags, and that's actually a deep, important philosophical point, but that's a different talk for a different day. But it's so fun to trigger them. But these are not feminists, as some of the Marxists would phrase it. These are not feminists of strict obedience. These are a new radical breed that arose primarily in the 1970s, and like I said, there were sex-positive radical feminists, which means they were very pro-sexual activity, which is not what the case was for the sex-negative radical feminists. Your Andrea Dworkins, your Susan Brown Miller, what's the other one? I always forget. Catherine McKinnon are the other big famous sex-negative. These people were much more feminists of strict obedience. They were definitely talking about sex roles, and they were very clear, and they of course wanted to preserve this, but the proto-queer theorists, such as Gail Rubin, wanted to just kind of mix sex, gender, sexuality into this kind of fluffy morass where everything's socially constructed and everything can be taken apart. And I'm just saying all that to set the table that there's this long ideological track that started over 50 years ago that ends us in the place where we're at a meeting today to talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria, because gender doesn't exist. Gender is a fabrication of a phenomenological, to be technical, a phenomenological interpretation of the world. In other words, to be also technical, it has a completely different metaphysic. It does not believe that reality precedes our understanding of reality. It believes that our understanding of reality is conditioned by who we are and the social circumstances that we're in. And so you, by definition, do not inhabit the same reality that I inhabit. So there's no shared reality between us, which means that our adjudications about reality are determined specifically by how much power we can exert to put forth our view of reality over others. And then we used a process that the Marxist George Lukács called social reification to make that become true effectively in the social realm, which makes it true in the only reality that matters from this perspective. And this is why I just want to set the table that this is what we're actually dealing with. A fundamental difference in baseline metaphysics about how the world is constructed, what our relationship to the world is. It does not follow the scientific. So a lot of people that come at this are not coming at it correctly. They need to do what they're doing with the biology and the data and all the things that we just heard in the previous talk. But they have to understand first that this ideological approach just considers all of that another unjust application of power that has to be discarded. In other words, has to be thrown into an ideological ghetto, which makes you low status if you interact with it. You are not on the vanguard of the forward progress of history if you're doing old business like looking at data, unless you're just cooking data to make it support your conclusion. A concept I really encourage a lot of people to think about is this little phrase. I find myself using it a lot lately, a conclusion in search of an argument. And this is actually what we're dealing with. They have concluded that not only is gender real as a phenomenon, it is primary. It is ahead of sex. That's a complete inversion of what we have. And they have that conclusion that it is now in search of an argument. It is in search of supporting data. And they look for it and they find it and they twist it and they bully people and they ruin people's lives. We just heard that you're afraid to speak up because you might get called a racist, you might get called a transphobe. All of these things. They bully people who have completely legitimate opinions that don't agree with theirs. They make articles get retracted. If you guys don't know what actually happened to Dr. Bailey in the 90s when he started to talk about the A word, autogynephilia, you should look it up. It's funny you ask him about being canceled. The man was canceled hard before canceling was a canceling. And so that was actually, by the way, Dr. Bailey, one of the things that made me decide I absolutely had to dive in on this when I found out how you and your colleagues were treated for talking about this in an academic way 30 years ago. Death threats, posting information about where they lived and their families, pictures of their kids. Run-of-the-mill operation for what kind of a person? Somebody's pushing a radical, militant ideology like Marxism, which I say all of this is derived from. So this isn't to talk about, I mean, I would love to just stand here for 2 hours and just bash feminists for it. I'm kidding. Hag's mad. Hag's mad. I would love to stand up here and talk to you about this kind of theoretical stuff, but I actually want to talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria since that's the conference that we're at, or the meeting. And so I want to add a lot of color to that social factors part of what was presented by Drs. Lippman and Bailey in the previous comment, because I don't think it's merely a contagion. Now, of course, the graphs that he showed match what I learned when I was a mathematician in a past life and I studied mathematical epidemiology. Those curves, that taking off exponential rise that we see roughly starting in 2007, the curve for the recovered memories, does it really follow this kind of bell-shaped thing? There's a theory or theorem in mathematical epidemiology called Farr's Law, F-A-R-R. Everybody should have learned about this in COVID because they were talking about how everything's going to be completely out of control and it's exponential growth and everything's going to be terrible. But they didn't actually tell you the truth. It's actually sigmoid growth, which follows Farr's Law. And we can expect that if this is indeed an epidemic, that we will see this shape of a curve. I want to give you a much more sinister interpretation than mere epidemic. I want to suggest that there is a driver, because this is ultimately ideological, which is why I wanted to briefly introduce the idea of the ideology, even though I didn't go into the details of what queer theory is. Queer theory is literally, by definition, according to David Halperin, who defined it, it is being against or opposed to, and in italics, whatever is considered normal or legitimate. So it is a rejection on principle against normalcy, legitimacy, or as I say it is rejecting limiting principles on principle. Anything that tells you you can't do this, including reality, like that you can't transform your sex through some magical medical process, anything that tells you no has to be resisted on principle. This is that kind of ideological push that we're dealing with. But what I want to talk about is this social factor milieu, and I want to draw a parallel to a historical circumstance that a lot of people are vaguely familiar with but not well read on, which is the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Because I believe that this is exactly what's driving this, especially in our young people. It's not the only factor, it's complicated. We all had to say it together, of course. It's not one thing. However, I want to tell you how Mao Zedong ran his Cultural Revolution, because a lot of people don't know. Now, if you don't know the history of China, we don't have time to get into all that. Mao actually did 2 revolutions to gain power twice, because he got kicked out after he botched everything with his so-called Great Leap Forward.
Right.
I hate when I mess those up. I really hate when I screw that up. The first one was a kind of a classical revolt, military coup. The second one was a cultural revolution, and it started in 1966, and it primarily weaponized young people, intellectual young people in particular. So people that had been going to his schools, people that had been participating in his youth programs, had been brought up on Mao Zedong thought, and he mobilized them to destroy his political enemies and regain his seat, which he did by the end of 1967. In early 1968, he then had all the young people, 17 million of them, rounded up and sent to Gulag re-education camp to die doing hard labor or in prison, all forced by the People's Liberation Army because they were too radical once he had power again. You don't want the destabilizers destabilizing you when you use them to steal power. I think that this is an important lesson for us. But the way that Mao did this basically was that he broke the population into 2 big categories that we could call the good guys and the bad guys. He called them the people and the enemies of the people. He coded them with class colors, red and black. We could also call them the people that believe we're moving forward. Those are the good people. And the people who believe that maybe there's nothing new under the sun, who are accused of supporting a thing called the status quo, or that we are not moving. So the progressives versus the non-progressives in some sense, or the progressives versus the conservatives, if you want. And so what he did was he took these 2 categories, the red category, the black category, the good guys versus the bad guys, the people and the enemies of the people. And it's a little more subtle than that. But what he did was he made a massive incentive structure for people to join the good team and to not want to be part of the bad team. The name of that incentive structure was given by Marx and adopted by Lenin and applied by Stalin and then taken up by Mao, and it's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And Mao said explicitly, as did Lenin, as did Stalin, that the point of the dictatorship of the proletariat is to smash your enemies. The enemies of the class, the enemies of the people have to be destroyed. But it's pretty sophisticated because Mao didn't really break the population into 2 categories. He broke them into 4 that looked like 2. And then he broke those into subdivisions that would be the birth of identity politics. So the red class, the good people, the people actually, were the laborers and the peasants that have their hammer and their sickle. That's communism, right? But then it was revolutionary leaders, revolutionary soldiers, revolutionary martyrs. So you actually have these 2 kind of categories within the red category. I'm not going to color code them and get weird with you, but you have these tokens. Everything's done in the name of the workers and the peasants, but they don't really care about the workers and the peasants. All you have to do is look at how the workers and especially the peasants were doing. In China, they were dying by the tens of millions through starvation, exposure, murder, disease. And then you have the revolutionary classes. The goal is actually not to get people to join the red class, it's to get them to become revolutionary activists. And then you have the black classes. The black classes are the enemies of the people. Were listed, and again, we're going to split them into 2. We're listed in as follows. It was going to be your rich landlords, your landlords and your rich farmers. So rich people and landlords, big problem. And then you have counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, we call them conspiracy theorists now, misinformation, disinformation artists. And then you had, just to really make it like broad, right-wingers. All right-wingers were on the wrong side of the society. And these black class categories were contagious, inheritable from your parents or grandparents 3 generations back, and contagious. If I spent too much time with somebody or fraternized with or helped or gave charity to somebody who was starving in the black class, even if I had red class status, I could catch black class status. In other words, it creates a social credit system that was pretty strictly enforced. This created something a little bit different than a social contagion of driving into the revolutionary class. It created a pressure pump to push people into the revolutionary class. Now, again, like I said, the black category was broken into 2 in practice, although never on paper. I think that the rich farmers and the landlords are like a scapegoat. They're the people you blame for everything going wrong, so that the poor farmers and the people who don't hold land will revolt against them and have wrath, and they're the people you blame for the problem. So Mao had this speech, a famous speech he gave called "Sweep Away the Monsters and Demons." Well, these are like the monsters, right? Then you have these people that are actively trying to prevent the development of socialism in China, and that would be the demons. Your counter-revolutionaries actively fighting against bad elements, spreading misinformation and disinformation, and then your right-wingers, which he later to that added revisionists. And the goal was to attack as much as you could. In the name of the tokens, you attack the counter-revolutionaries, and then you very unjustly attack and victimize the monster class, as it would be. And the goal was to take all 3 classes and force people to want to become revolutionaries. So in our day, in our school, this is the social environment that our kids find themselves in. And this is pushed from the highest levels of our government. This is Department of Education policy. This is the kind of thing that Tiffany Justice told me a few minutes ago comes from the Arcus Foundation, which is headed, is that right? Kamala Harris's sister, Maya, is significant. We'll leave it at that in the Arcus Foundation. So there's massive ties between the government and big business and other entities actually working to push this. Why would businesses do this? Well, it matches their ESG score. That's why. They have to get their ESG scores if they want to play in the social credit system that's been built for corporations. It's exactly like the business model that works in China that Deng Xiaoping developed after Mao died, where they're going to have one country, 2 systems, a communist government, but a literally fascist economic system that works according to bringing glory to the communist government to advance communist goals. So there are a lot of pressures, but what is the environment for our children in this? Our children are primary targets. Our children, they understand for certain that if they want to get the future, they have to get our children. And there are lots of ways to get children. We talked about Tumblr. Tumblr was a great way to get children. A lot of disordered and troubled youth spent a lot of time on that social media platform. I reckon some of them still do. The reason that Tumblr kind of fell out of the public eye isn't because it's so unpopular. It is because a few years ago, in 15 or so, they banned pornography. And all of a sudden, the thing just fell apart. So it wasn't just disordered young people. They were not just talking with one another. They were engaging in online sexual behavior. And of course, this became a haven for groomers, and it was kind of famously known for being a haven for groomers who could hide behind an immense anonymity and talk to people about whatever. But that's not this pressure pump. We also have generally media that's lionizing this new forward-moving, forward direction, very joyful forward direction of history, and demonizing people as transphobes or homophobes or backwards or whatever else, or misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theorists, people that don't go along. So there's a strong social pressure for people to go along with this that creates kind of a cultural milieu in which it's supported to go this way and not supported to resist it, as we already heard from the previous questioner. And more than that, it's a saturated media environment. The media companies are virtually producing, the mainstream big ones that have lots of funding are producing basically this and nothing else. Look at Disney willing to lose, over $90 billion now to continue this agenda. There are reasons that companies would be willing to lose $90 billion to keep pushing something that's extraordinarily unpopular with their target demographic. And none of the reasons are good. But then in the schools, it's not just that the schools are actually teaching this in the form of teaching gender ideology and aspects of queer theory to the children, as we document in Queering of the American Child. It's that the school creates a social environment in which that same dynamic in the broader public is magnified and presented to children in very stark good versus evil terms. and it's presented in very therapeutic language, and it's presented in a way that every time you have a kid who's troubled, it becomes a justification to bring more therapeutic language in. It becomes a form of universal screening in the school to find disordered or especially questioning children, whether it's questioning their sexuality or their gender or their personality or who they are or if they fit in, and then to funnel them into after-school clubs like the Gender Sexuality Alliance that then can do this kind of at scale. So it doesn't even have to be. It is in the classroom, but it doesn't have to be in the classroom. The goal is to saturate the environment with the ideological perspective. Art people would call it socialist realism, but that's another talk for another day. And so this creates an enormous pressure on them, especially when they're simultaneously, here's the Mao part, when they're simultaneously learning that their race is wrong, their national origin is wrong, that they're a boring, basic white girl or whatever it happens to be, and the only way to become cool and the only way to escape the negative association, the ghetto, as it were, of these black class identities, these low status identities, the only path you have is to adopt a revolutionary identity. Well, what are some revolutionary identities? Ally, activist, and then you never can do those right. But there's one that's totally in the realm of the phenomenological and the subjective that you can pick when nobody's allowed to question it. They're only allowed to affirm you in that environment, and it's some gender or sexual identity that no one's allowed to question. So I posit to you controversially, and the point of my whole talk now in the last sentence is that the rapid onset gender dysphoria is, yes, partly a social contagion like we've seen in these past models, like we've seen with the recovered memories, or bulimia is another famous example of this. It is partly a social contagion, but it is driven by ideological operators working at the highest levels, including the Department of Education, the US federal government, and the United Nations through UNESCO, to bring this to our children, to transform them into a revolutionary gender or sexual identity that splits them from their family, puts them at odds with their society, leaves them with few options so they'll be destabilized and wish to revolt, just like Mao's Red Guard. And my fear is, when they're done with them, when they get whatever they want out of this, they will discard them just like Mao did. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'll start with a comment that hashtag HagsMad has got to get out there
HagsMad.
along with merch. Questions for Dr. Lindsay. All right, let's start in the back.
Hi, I'm Corey Cohn. I've been testifying in legislatures in Texas, Indiana, and Ohio, where we've got legislation passed that prohibits doctors from doing sex change procedures on children. So, Wisconsin should be someday soon, and we're just going to remove Illinois from the union. Yeah, but every single one of these states that I've been to, there are clergy members who are Episcopalian or United Methodist or other left-wing Protestant denominations who are coming, and their whole mindset is that they want to help these children become their true, authentic selves. I know that you've spoken about Gnosticism before, but I do not want to underestimate how powerful it is that these churches are getting involved and activating their members at the legislative level to try to embed these types of medical procedures in their kids. And they might be Marxists. That might be part of what informs their ideology, because at the seminaries, this is actually something that's starting to become a big deal. But I'd like you to comment about what Gnosticism is and how that affects the ideology that's associated with gender identity activism.
Thank you. Thank you for your work, too. I appreciate it a lot. So just a quick anecdote, since you mentioned these left-leaning churches, I recently went to speak at Cape Cod, and I got there and I figured I'm in Massachusetts, this is going to be like every color of the rainbow everywhere I turn, on flags, on buildings, whatever. Turns out, no. Every other building, and I mean it, almost like every other house, every other business, almost every other building had an American flag style banners draped across, the front. I'm like, where am I? Is it required because I'm in a, historic American location? And it turns out, no, they're like super into USA, and the only pride flags I saw were flying on churches. Congregationalist, Episcopal, and so on. The only pride flags I saw were flying on churches. It was a really interesting and jarring experience. Now, to be fair, I was in the so-called conservative part of Cape Cod, not down on the end at Provincetown where it's super, super this way. And I also want to mention, just as a second piece here, that, are these people, this question is, are these people knowingly Marxist? It's hard to say. Marxism actually needs to be thought of as kind of a cult value system. You can adopt the values, you can adopt the metaphysics, you can adopt the perspective on the world without knowing a single word of it, without ever having read a single word of it. And so think of it like as a set of new intuitions that point you in a particular direction and a particular behavior, and then you kind of copycat off of people using those general expressions. So you don't actually have to be knowingly Marxist. But so far as the churches go, what we're seeing in those churches that are flying those flags is that they were particularly influenced by a movement that started with the Baptists, of all things. It was called the social gospel, which was actually the infusion by a man named Walter Rauschenbusch of Fabian socialism into American Protestant Christianity starting in 1905. You can look up Rauschenbusch's book. It's called The Social Gospel. You can read it. You can see the roots of everything written down in 1905. And the churches have been a vector of bringing these ideas in. The left-leaning churches have been. But since you want me to comment on Gnosticism, I'm going to talk about a queer theorist I didn't mention yet. Two of them, actually. The most famous two, probably, Michel Foucault, who could be considered the founder, and Judith Butler, who is, I call her the fairy godmother of queer theory. I'm sure that would piss her off, which makes me really happy. Hag's mad. But one of their famous sentences, and I'll tell you what Gnosticism is in a second, but one of Foucault's sentences that Judith Butler references repeatedly is, it's not so much that the body imprisons the soul as it is that the soul imprisons the body. And then you get Judith talking about how we take our social expectations, so that's like a spiritual force of society, and inscribe it, literally that's our word, inscribe it on our external form. So if we're born male and a doctor assigns us male at birth, and then the society, our parents, and everybody says, oh, it's a boy, and we treat it like a boy, then we learn to inscribe on ourselves masculinity, and we grow up and reproduce the performance of masculinity as a male. Whereas Judith Butler would have it, we're doing, even as a man, we're still doing male drag. And if you were born a female, you're still doing female drag, whether you're a woman or not. So the only person that's actually aware of what they're doing is the drag queen, who's now this kind of enlightened soul. And this should throw some color on what's happening now. But the deal with Gnosticism, I use that, it's not so much that the body imprisons the soul as it is that the soul imprisons the body. Who in the hell talks about life as being a prison? Gnostics. The old Gnostic cults going back centuries before Christ, but taking kind of a high watermark in the first century in Christian forms, heretical Christian forms that the early church had to fight and stamp out. Credit to Irenaeus and his book Against Heresies, 800 pages of absolutely being based. It turns out that these believed that the story given in Genesis, the God in Genesis, is actually an evil demon that's called the demiurge. That's from the Greek word for builder or artisan, the creator of the world. And he's actually an evil demon who's imprisoning man, who is actually as God already. We are little gods who've been imprisoned in this first Garden of Eden, and then we get kicked out into the miserable world when we try to become, equal by Eve's sin. I throw you to the parallel, by the way, of The Matrix, where the evil Matrix guy, Tommy Lee Jones's character, Agent Smith, says, at first we built you a utopia, but your brains rejected it, so now you get the 1990s. This is the same idea, the same motif. But the idea that reality itself and who we are and how we are expected to be is a prison imposed on us by an evil alien force is the definition of Gnosticism. Gnosis or Gnostic refers to a special interpersonal knowledge of the real truth of reality. Who you actually are on the inside would be one way to say that allows you to escape the oppression of the prison. It's much different to suffer in prison when you know you're in prison and maybe there's a spiritual escape route. And I have made, quite controversially as well, forwarded the argument that in the early 19th century, the German idealist Hegel, followed by Karl Marx, actually, and preceding them both, the French Jean-Jacques Rousseau, actually man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains, actually forwarded an idea of a social system being the force instead of a spirit, transcendent, demon or whatever that imprisons mankind in our social norms and expectations. And the goal is to understand that and break free. I call it social Gnosticism or sociological Gnosticism. And I think that queer theory is just a very visible form of that's being enacted, or gender ideology, on the body. Following Butler, they're inscribing on their body the attempt to Gnostically reject the prison that they've been forced into by the powers of society, by the so-called the bourgeois demiurge, or the heteronormative demiurge, if you want, in this case, that's forcing them to be how they actually aren't and obscuring their true nature, in fact, alienating them from their true nature. So I think that fundamentally this is a religious movement posing as a political movement, and if we don't wise up to that, if we keep thinking it's economics and social politics and big medicine, then we're missing 90% of the story.
Yes. Other questions? You can raise your hand. Here we go.
James, I wondered if you could say more about the moral dimension of this. I'm thinking particularly of therapeutic morality, because it seems to me that one of the reasons why this is possible is that our highest good now is the authentic self. And that's what seems to underpin all of the support for transition, particularly in kids. And I almost feel like we're seeing a sort of moral revolution. And I wonder how you square that with the sort of Marxism element.
Sure. So what I just said about Gnosticism all immediately applies exactly. So I'm not going to repeat that. But if you actually look at, we could do this for, basically, you pick a Marxist through history. I can do it for that Marxist probably, if they're big enough that I've read their work. But I'm going to pick a famous one from the 60s who's considered the father of the New Left, who's extremely relevant to our time, Herbert Marcuse. I would say that he was the importer of American Maoism. So he took what this identity politics concept that Mao was using in some of his other ideas and imported those. He got rid of the working class as the base for revolution, and he said the revolution will now be located in the combination of the young intelligentsia in the colleges and universities combined with the members of the ghetto populations, namely gender and sexual minority. Well, he just said sexual minorities, so there'd be homosexuals, women, feminists, racial minorities, and other outsiders, including the mentally ill. Those are going to be paired with the young intelligentsia with new ideology in order to affect the revolution. And so the way that he said that this would be done was through what he called a transvaluation of values. He actually titled the chapter in the Essay on Liberation in 1969, he titled it A Biological Foundation for Socialism. And then he immediately, the first time he uses the word, uses an asterisk, and he says, I don't mean biology literally like eugenics. I mean transforming people at the level of their basic vital needs so that their instinctual habits and behaviors reflect the pursuit of socialism because they find the capitalist-driven world unbearable and impossible to live in. And the entirety of the first two chapters of the essay are about creating a new set of values, identifying true versus false needs, and pursuing only the true needs and dropping the false needs. And ultimately coming up with a new set of values that, in his words, are a great refusal of the existing society. In fact, not just a great refusal, a protest against, in his own words, the entirety of a prosperous, well-functioning society, indeed, a protest against its very form. So even the Platonic ideal of a capitalist society and a well-functioning, prosperous society is out the window. And he says the way this is going to happen is to bring a new moral dimension. He calls it a new sensibility through this radical vanguard that I just mentioned. So there's this attempt to create this new value system, and I think it piggybacks off of Maoism, but not that Mao was any kind of great humanitarian or famous for caring about people. But I think one of the inroads that it found in American culture is that we do care about people who are hurting. I think of the church sign that was up in my neighborhood near my neighborhood for a long time that said, "We love hurting people," which church sign jokes never fail to amuse me. We care about people who are in pain. So this therapeutic culture, especially coming out of the pop psychology of the 60s, 70s, Oprah Winfrey in the 80s and 90s, mainstreaming a lot of this. By the way, she's also a transform the world. She's not a Christian, by the way. Oprah Winfrey is a theosophist. But that's another story altogether. All of this was mainlined as kind of the new kind of basis for this value system, and the buzzword that's used for it that attaches to these issues is inclusion. Everything has to be inclusive, 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 inclusive. That turns out to be a program that was derived by Lenin and Stalin in the early 1920s that was applied as the second priority of the Soviet Union, according to their writings, and then it was reformed in this very therapeutic form in mostly the 1970s around race and sexual minorities in order to kind of have a soft entryism, as the Soviets call it, to get in. So I think there has been an undermining of our value system where it's actually low status, or it's actually chauvinistic was a word used in the communist countries, to hold to American values or to real values that actually help people prosper. And so you have to have this kind of, I don't know, inclusion is the right word. You have to be a pushover and accommodate and enable all the time. So we've moved into a weird upside down therapeutic culture where actually the first priority, say if you had an addict or whatever, look at the drug situation on the West Coast, is to enable the problem in a clean way or whatever, rather than to try to help them find a solution to the problem. And I think that maps so one-to-one for this gender dysphoria problem that it doesn't even need elaboration to say what's going on there.
Okay, I think this will be last question.
Yeah, I talk a lot.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Thank you, James. So what role should and can parents be playing in ending this ideology?
Parents have got to get very hands-on with their children, not in the literal sense. They've got to get very involved in their lives. Oh no, you have to engage with your kids. We've spent a lot of time, and if you ask your average parent right now, why don't you want to homeschool? Just as an example, not necessarily everybody wants to, but if you ask them why don't you want to, invariably, the two answers that you get most commonly are, I don't know how, and that's a matter of that's easy to get around. Oh, there's all these resources, let me get you in a network, blah, blah, blah. Done, right? So that's a real excuse for people in ignorance, but it's easily overcome. And the other one is, how am I going to have daycare? Who's going to take care of my kids when I go to work? How am I going to do it with me going to work? And so parents have got to get a lot more directly involved. When I said hands-on, that's what I mean, directly involved in their kids' lives. You have to start asking them questions. You're going to have to learn about this ideology, gender ideology and or queer theory specifically, but also the broader nexus of all of these. They're progressive in the strict sense, but they're not moving society in a better direction since these ideas like critical race theory and queer theory and disability studies and so on, these very leftist, or I would actually tell you, Marxist interpretations of difference in society, you're going to have to get at least basic level informed and conversant in them. I've spent the last 6 years trying to produce a library of materials for people to do that, and you're more than welcome to use mine. Other people have run off and done excellent work. I encourage you to use theirs. If you think I'm crazy, that's fine, I don't care. I'm a bad element, that's okay. Use somebody else's. I don't care. Alvin's in the back. He's got great resources. I don't care. Moms for Liberty is putting out great resources. They're great. But you've got to understand enough to have the real conversations with your kids, basically to effect an inoculation. They have to know. The old saying is that you prepare the child for the road. You don't prepare the road for the child. We obviously see that the logic of society is the opposite with this safetiest, therapeutic helicopter parent, kid in a bumper suit model that we kind of live right now. That's wrong. You've got to prepare your kid for the road, and part of the road right now is rapid onset gender dysphoria, and in my opinion, the ideological pressure pump to drive kids into it. So you better prepare them for that road. It is your job, parents, to take the responsibility to raise your children to prepare for the world that they're going to enter. So you've got to do that. You've got to become informed yourself, and you've got to make that bond. Part of the biggest point of these ideologies, in particular the queer theory ideologies or gender ideologies, are specifically to put your children in a position where they will reject you as their parents. They are doing something that they know, or they're told, your parents won't like this, so don't tell them. The school will keep your secret. We're a trusted adult. Your parents might not be. This is designed to put a division. We're going to have one identity for you at school that you get to live out, and you can do whatever your parents make you do at home. So now they feel like they're gnostically in prison at home, and they get to be liberated when they're in the school. And so what you've got to do is get involved. If you can, get completely involved. Homeschool is the best option, period. Plus, you're going to get involved in a group that's fighting for freedom more than anybody else. I understand not everybody can do it, so you've got to get involved directly with your children, and you've got to get involved in organizations and activities like this that are going to actually bring us over the top of that curve. I don't know where we are, Tiffany, on that curve either, but we need to get over the top of that curve that's medicalizing and socially transitioning kids, and we have to be involved in organizations like this, sharing information, giving courage to people who need it, and network to people who need it, so that we can do that. So parents, get off the couch, get with your kids, and then show up and get informed and activated. Thank you.
Thank you.